Good evening, and once again a very, very warm welcome to all of you. We, Robin Celikates and myself, Rahel Jaeggi, we are thrilled actually to see so many of you again here tonight for the third of Tommie Shelby's Benjamin Lectures, the yearly lecture series that is the annual highlight of our activities at the Center for Social Critique.
So the two incredibly rich and inspiring lectures of the last two evenings laid out the role of solidarity in the political ethics of the oppressed. Solidarity, Tommie argued, is central to struggles against racist and other forms of oppression, class-based oppression. It is shaped by shared experiences of oppression and held together by common bonds that are forged in collective struggle. But as Tommie argued, the demands of solidarity can also come into conflict with individual aspirations to self-realization and with the intellectual's inclination to question and to dissent. That was the topic of yesterday's lecture. As Tommie argued, the resulting tensions should not be seen as a threat that we need to overcome, but rather as a source of productive friction that is central to the political ethics of the oppressed. Tonight, we will hear about the last piece of the puzzle in Tommie's final lecture entitled Self-Respect and the Value of Protest.
The showdown tonight. So we will not introduce you to Tommie Shelby again because by now, after these two wonderful evenings, he really doesn't need an introduction. Actually, the last Benjamin lecture is always a bit of an ambivalent event for us because on the one hand, it's the grand finale to which we are all looking forward to, as I said, the showdown, or at least now we get to know who the murderer is. But it's also always a bit sad that we won't be returning in the coming days to this wonderful lecture in the wonderful hall and to keep on discussing these deeply significant questions. But of course, it's not yet time to say goodbye. After the lecture, we will have again some time for questions for a Q&A. And like yesterday, there are two mics in the aisles. And we would like to ask you to ask questions. Und Sie können, wie gestern auch, die Fragen dann sehr gerne auch auf Deutsch stellen. Und vielleicht noch einmal die Erinnerung, alle diejenigen, die den Vorträgen gerne auf Deutsch folgen möchten. Unten gibt es Headsets und die entsprechenden Empfangsgeräte dafür. Wir haben hier eine Simultanübersetzung. So, over to you, Tommie. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I thank you both again just for your incredible, hospitality since I've been here, and just been so warm and welcoming, and I'm truly honored to be able to give these lectures and to be in conversation with you all. And I appreciate you all being here on a Friday evening. When you could be doing all manner of things, but I'm glad you're here to talk with me about these issues. And I have special thanks to the hardcore of you who did all three lectures, heroic. So thanks so much for that. So, any credible account of political ethics, I think, must affirm that oppressed people have not only the right, but also the responsibility to resist injustices inflicted upon them. But this responsibility isn't grounded in a single moral principle. It rests actually, I think, on at least two distinct foundations. So first, we have our general obligation to challenge injustice with the aim of correcting it. This is the duty to confront systems of oppression whenever doing so might meaningfully contribute to ending them or mitigating the harm that they do. So in this sense, resistance by the unjustly disadvantaged is a part of a broader moral project, the pursuit of a more just world. But there is a second, equally important ground for resisting injustice, and that is the duty to respect oneself. So even when resistance may not advance justice in, say, in any tangible way, it can be necessary as a form of self-affirmation. Resisting injustice in this case is not about changing the world per se, it's about honoring one's own moral worth. Self-respect is a matter of recognizing oneself as a rational agent and as a moral equal, and valuing oneself accordingly. Individuals with self-respect conduct themselves in a way that reflects a deep belief in their own value. Their actions show that they see themselves as worthy of respect, and they respond accordingly when treated unjustly, with indignation and protest. So in this final lecture, my central goal is to explore the moral importance of affirming self-respect through acts of protest, and to understand why such resistance is essential to the political ethics of the oppressed. I'll also consider moments when compromising one's self-respect may still be compatible with dignity. And I'll try to explain how solidarity among the oppressed can sometimes call for public demonstrations of self-respect. And as before, I'm going to draw on some insights and draw inspiration even from the life and writings of Richard Wright. So let me begin with a story from Wright's childhood, a moment of resistance to wrongful treatment. When Wright was just a boy living in Memphis, his mother sent him to the store to buy groceries for the family. On his way, he was confronted by a group of boys who attacked him, stole his money, and left him shaken and humiliated. He ran home in tears, hoping for comfort. But his mother, unwavering, told him he had to go back. He could not return without the groceries. Still trembling, he obeyed. But again, the gang, they were waiting. They robbed him and beat him a second time. So he returned home, crying even harder, frightened, pleading not to be sent out again. His mother remained firm. But this time, she handed him a long, heavy stick and told him plainly he must go back, and if attacked again, he would have to fight. No choice, Wright headed toward the store. When the boys approached, he gripped the stick tightly and just lashed out with fury. The boys scattered. He bought the groceries. He walked home, and this time he felt something different: pride. Now, this is in one way a familiar story about the value of facing our fears, finding courage, standing up to bullies. That moral lesson is straightforward, it's a universal lesson, but I actually think that Wright is foreshadowing a deeper moral lesson here, an ethical truth about self-respect and protest under conditions of oppression. We can begin to see that lesson by returning again to the Jim Crow regime of racial segregation and the culture of fear and docility that it bred. Under the Jim Crow regime, it wasn't enough for Black people to follow its unjust rules. They were expected to do so without complaint and without protest. The system demanded not just submission, but also subservience with good cheer. Open resentment or resistance was met with swift and often brutal punishment. Really no hint of Black anger toward white people was tolerated. Indeed, white violence was directed primarily toward those who dared to challenge their assigned place in the social hierarchy. But perhaps the most insidious feature of this system was how deeply it shaped the minds and the character of Black people. Over time, many Black individuals came to internalize the expectations of Jim Crow, learning to suppress their own righteous anger and even to police each other's behavior. So in this way, the system didn't just dominate from the outside, it coerced people into becoming unwitting agents of their own subjugation. This was an oppressive cultural ethos that encouraged Black people to be cowardly and cynical. Now, Wright recounts several stories from his life that explain how he and others come to learn this ethos and how the ethos is inculcated. So in one story, his Uncle Tom received the teenage Wright's tone of voice as disrespectful. Taking umbrage, Uncle Tom announced that he would punish Wright with a beating to teach him proper deference. But Wright would have none of that. He says he seized razor blades in both hands and assumed a stance of defiance, of self-defense, and his uncle, in this case, relented. Wright felt he had done really nothing to earn his uncle's resentment or wrath in this case. Indeed, he disdainfully recalls that Uncle Tom, quote, was going to teach me to act as I had seen the backward Black boys on the plantation, was going to teach me to grin, to hang my head, and mumble apologetically when I was spoken to. My senses reeled in protest. In another story, Wright was walking his bike to work after getting a flat tire and was offered a ride. The car was full of young white men who had been drinking. One of them offered Wright a drink, and Wright politely declined. Then one of the men hit Wright in the face with a whiskey bottle, knocking him from the speeding car. The men stopped the car, and they stood over Wright, with one saying, "Nigga, ain't you learned no better sense than that yet? Ain't you learned to say sir to a white man yet?" Now, Wright also recounts a disturbing incident from his time working for two white men who owned a clothing store. So one day, a Black woman who had failed to pay her credit bill, she was dragged from the street and beaten viciously in the street and in the store. She left the store battered and bloodied. And yet a police officer standing nearby did nothing to stop or respond to the assault. White passersby simply walked on, seemingly unaffected. Afterward, as the woman stumbled down the street in visible pain, that same officer arrested her, not in this case for any crime related to the incident, but for appearing drunk in public. Wright's employer, smiling, turned to him and said, "Boy, that's what we do to niggas when they don't pay their bills." And it is striking, that Wright does not in this case present himself as resistant or particularly defiant. He admits that he stood by silently, offering no protest as the woman was kicked and dragged. Nor did he speak up later when the incident was turned into a cruel joke. So this story underscores not only the brutal reality of racial violence under Jim Crow, but also the sort of paralyzing fear and internalized oppression that made resistance so difficult, even for someone like Wright, who had a profound sense of pride and a naturally rebellious spirit. So Wright's first serious effort to develop what I've been here calling a political ethics of the oppressed, it appears in his 1938 short story collection, Uncle Tom's Children. So I think these 5 stories are best understood as works of philosophical fiction. I don't think they're merely compelling literary narratives that take up interesting themes. They engage deeply with the question of how the oppressed ought to respond to the injustices that shape their lives. In these stories, Wright is attempting, I think, to outline a moral framework that he thinks the oppressed should embody, something to aspire to. Now, I don't think I'm here imposing a kind of philosophical reading on Wright's early fiction. I'm actually, I think, following Wright's own lead. In his memoir, Black Boy, Wright was explicit that these stories posed and attempted to answer a philosophical question. Namely, and I quote, "What quality of will must a Negro possess to live and die with dignity in a country that denied his humanity?" Wright's answer is, in a way, cryptically stated in a very epigraph of Uncle Tom's Children. He says, "The post-Civil War household word among Negroes, he's an Uncle Tom, which denoted reluctant toleration for the cringing type who knew his place before white folk, has been supplanted by a new word from another generation, which says, Uncle Tom is dead." Now, Wright makes it clear that the time of the cringing type of black person, as he calls him, the one who quietly and readily submits to racial oppression, must come to an end. That approach to living has to die. And in these stories, we see the emergence of a sort of a new ethic, sort of one grounded in resistance and in a refusal to stay confined to the social roles that are violently imposed by white supremacy. The protagonists in Uncle Tom's Children, they push back against the boundaries set for them, even when doing so risks violent retaliation. For Wright, what defines this new generation, what makes them Uncle Tom's children, is the way they overcome their fear by fighting back when confronted with injustice. Each of the 5 stories introduces us to a protagonist. There's Big Boy, there's Silas, there's Man, Reverend Taylor, and Sue. They each openly defy their oppressors in some dramatic way. Their acts of resistance, though rarely lead to sort of liberation in any kind of meaningful sense. But I think that's actually Wright's main point here. So fighting back is not only about defeating oppression or reducing suffering, though that's critical. It's also about reclaiming one's dignity. Resistance in Wright's vision is both a moral imperative and a form of self-affirmation. It carries meaning and value even when it does not lead to concrete political change. Now, Wright's protagonists are not moral archetypes, unlike the saintly, selfless figure in Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's nothing like a sort of Christ figure in Wright's work. These are ordinary individuals, they're flawed, they're conflicted, and at times weak. Wright does not present them as perfect embodiments of the political ethic that he seeks to highlight and defend. On the contrary, many of these characters falter, some quite tragically. His stories often dramatize the negative consequences of failing to embrace this ethic, as if the moral universe itself sort of delivered a kind of sanction for blameworthy submission. At the same time, his characters vividly capture the moral tension of being caught between two worlds, right? The inherited ethic of fear and servility, and the emerging ethic of defiance and self-respect. These characters, they struggle, often agonizingly, to resist the urge to acquiesce. What Wright focuses on most intently in these stories are the challenging, everyday moral decisions that Black people had to make under the crushing weight of Jim Crow. He suggests that the wrong choices were not born of any kind of inherent weakness in Black people, but were the result of a deep social conditioning enforced most often by the practice of lynching. The culture of fear and passivity under segregation shaped people's behavior in powerful ways, making resistance challenging. Wright's philosophical aim, then, I think, is to dramatize this moral struggle. He understands and he empathizes with the survival strategies the oppressed have forged, but he ultimately calls for a break with ethics of fear. In their place, he urges the cultivation of a new, more courageous moral outlook, an ethics of the oppressed, grounded in self-respect. Yet it might seem, and it's often seemed this way to me, mysterious. Why self-respect requires public protest when such open resistance isn't actually aimed at improving one's condition or affecting some kind of concrete struggle? Provided one recognizes one's inherent moral worth and knows that one deserves better treatment than one is currently getting, why must one protest injustice? So in this case, maybe the black conservative thinker Booker T. Washington was correct when he suggested that it would actually be undignified to protest the injustice, as if one somehow doubted that one had inherent moral worth. A number of philosophers taking up this question, trying to understand what really is grounding this call for self-respect, includes people like Thomas Hill, Bernard Boxall, and many others. Many have emphasized that the moral failure of those who lack self-respect is that they don't express the right attitude toward themselves as persons. When a person accepts injustice without protest or any kind of resistance, the thought here is that they're not giving moral principles a serious weight that they merit. One should communicate in one way or another that the mistreatment is wrong. Why? To signal recognition of one's own moral value. I think there's a great merit in this response, but those living under conditions of grave injustice, for those living under conditions of grave injustice, self-respect seems to have a further meaning. Holding on to self-respect in the face of oppression is certainly about abstract moral principles, but it's not only about honoring abstract moral principles. It reflects a personal commitment to one's own worth. If self-respect were only about reverence for moral imperatives, it's hard for me to see how it could explain this sort of profound personal significance that it often has for those who are treated wrongly. Self-respect seems to matter not just from an impartial moral standpoint, but from the perspective of the individual living that life. Oppression inflicts more than external harm. It can erode the inner sense of moral worth that underlies self-respect. And repeated exposures to injustice can lead individuals to question whether they truly possess equal moral standing. Now, we might understand an attack on self-respect as any action, any policy, or social practice that aims, whether directly or indirectly, to instill a sense of moral inferiority, a sense that one is less deserving of fair treatment than others. In the face of such attacks, those who are oppressed sometimes respond not with resignation, but with defiance. They demand justice not necessarily because they believe it's practically within reach, but because doing so is an affirmation of their moral worth. They stand to stand one's ground then when faced with injustice, especially when doing so comes at some personal cost or risk, is a profound expression of self-respect. It's a kind of moral achievement, if you like. And this form of self-valuing is what we might call moral pride. And so conversely, willful submission to injustice can constitute a kind of moral failure, a source of moral shame. When we endure indignity without resistance, or when we exchange our dignity for comfort, security, or approval, we forfeit or sacrifice our self-respect. Those who possess a strong sense of self-respect often refuse to comply with unjust demands and expectations. They speak out against oppression that they experience, they defy illegitimate authority, they resist discriminatory treatment, not, again, because they expect immediate change, but because their sense of worth compels them to act. Now, to be clear, the aim here is not anything like revenge. It's not about exacting retribution against those who have caused you harm. Rather, it's really about safeguarding something perhaps even more vital, a secure and enduring sense of one's own moral worth. Without that secure sense, life can become marked with shame, even sometimes self-contempt. Also, we shouldn't confuse self-respect with, say, ordinary self-defense. Defending oneself physically is, of course, a matter of preserving bodily integrity, but defending one's self-respect through protest is about preserving one's moral pride. This is, of course, in some ways less tangible, but I think no less essential to a well-lived life. Now, I've argued for many of these points before in various writings in various ways, and I continue to think that they're basically sound. But as I've been thinking about Wright's work over the last several years and teaching and writing, I've come to think that he was actually seeking to understand a sort of different dimension of self-respect. I think Wright was interested in what we might call the moral psychology of self-respect. His focus was on how, practically speaking, to move beyond the ethos of fear through a kind of risky defiance. So remember, Jim Crow violence wasn't just a penalty for noncompliance with segregation norms. The arbitrary and malicious violence of the regime really sort of seeped into the souls of Black people. It made them fearful and timid at times. So what's Wright's hypothesis here? This kind of fear, he thinks, is best overcome by consistently standing up for oneself when mistreated. Defiance through a kind of symbolic protest helps to develop a kind of key virtue in the oppressed. Active and open resistance is the means through which the oppressed cultivate and maintain a healthy sense of self-worth and avoid the vice of servility. This focus on fear and its damaging effects runs throughout much of Wright's work. As I've been reading it over the years, he repeatedly returns to the theme of fear caused by racial oppression and the unavoidable choice between submission, flight, and fighting back. Indeed, he was himself profoundly affected by his fear of white racism, as he admits. Reflecting on his childhood in the Jim Crow South, he says, "A dread of white people now came to live permanently in my feelings and imagination. Nothing challenged the totality of my personality so much as this pressure of hate and threat that stemmed from the invisible whites. I would stand for hours on the doorsteps of neighbors' houses listening to their talk, learning how a white woman had slapped a Black woman, how a white man had killed a Black man. It filled me with awe, wonder, and fear." For Wright, then, protest, here publicly condemning and fighting back against injustice, is a moral practice that at least potentially dissolves a person's fear of their oppressors. It's a kind of moral reform for the vices of servility and resignation. It helps to restore or instill an appropriate sense of moral pride in the subjugated. When successful, such protest brings about a kind of moral transformation in the oppressed, a dramatic change that represents a kind of freedom itself, emancipation from a servile and hopeless existence. So to fully appreciate Wright's perspective, it might help to compare it to a closely related view from another figure in the Black radical tradition, Frantz Fanon. So in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon famously, and of course controversially, defended political violence as a legitimate response to the dehumanizing forces of colonial domination. And he offered a range of reasons for why violence within the context of anti-colonial resistance can be not only appropriate, but transformative. Poverty and famine, desperate material need here, drive the colonized to violence for their very survival. Fanon argued that the violence of the colonized is only counterviolence, a form of self-defense. Because such violence is a kind of mass violence, it also forges solidarity among the native population. And this unity will be useful, he thought, in the post-colonial context. Fanon, moreover, believed that self-respect could only be regained through a willingness to use violence to gain one's freedom. It's a way of affirming one's equal standing in a world that denies your humanity. But I think most relevant here is that Fanon maintained that political violence was a psychological cure for the oppressed, as colonial domination damaged the psyche of the colonized. Fanon was, of course, a psychiatrist in the psychoanalytic tradition, and he thought fighting back against the colonizer could serve as a kind of treatment for the inferiority complex and self-hate of the colonized. It could restore their sense of pride and hope and self-confidence. Such violence, he thought, was also cathartic, and so could prevent various mental disorders. It could purge, he thought, the spirit of colonialism that's lodged in the very unconscious of the native population. It could release them from the symptoms of repression created by their subjugation, including, he thought, their tendency to displace their anger through attacks on one another. Now, this way of thinking about political resistance, whether violent or nonviolent, is framed primarily as a kind of behavioral therapy. Although Wright, too, was interested in the mental health of the oppressed, his calling for affirming self-respect through protest, on my reading, is not best interpreted as a call for psychological therapy. What he's doing is he's describing a sort of normative ethical orientation, a kind of moral practice. And his primary interest here is ethical, in fact, and not medical. His main concern is with the dignity of the oppressed, not primarily with their mental well-being. So recall the animating question of Uncle Tom's Children. What quality of will must a Negro possess to live and die with dignity in a country that denied his humanity? And so what I'm suggesting is that protesting injustice is the means through which the oppressed cultivate and maintain the necessary quality of will, the firm disposition to see oneself as a moral agent that merits equal respect. This is not simply about one's moral convictions, it's really about one's character. A virtuous character can be created and sustained only through practical activities that mold one's dispositions and habits of mind. So I've been arguing for the importance of self-respect primarily by highlighting the moral responsibilities it places on the oppressed. When individuals fail to uphold this commitment, when they don't affirm their self-respect by protesting injustice, say, they are sometimes rightly subject to moral disapproval. Now, because this is a somewhat unsettling implication, any attempt to defend the ethics of the oppressed will be received by some as, in a way, a kind of lack of sympathy for the people who are severely disadvantaged. For inevitably, some among the oppressed, perhaps most, will fail to meet the demands of such an ethic. But I think that empathy can be joined with mutual accountability. We can even love and cherish those whom we sometimes blame for their unethical attitudes and conduct. Undoubtedly, oppressed individuals often often have good excuses for not affirming their self-respect through protest. The risks or sacrifices can often just be too much to ask, right, or too much to really expect. So here, they're not in any way blameworthy, and they really only warrant our sympathy and support. And I would insist that being oppressed is not in itself a sufficient excuse. Victims of injustice should, of course, not be blamed for the fact that they're oppressed, right? But they can sometimes act unethically in their responses to their plight. And it is these responses here that's really my subject here. So I want to focus for a moment on two types of compromises of self-respect that I doubt are always excusable. So the first is a kind of, we might call, undignified sycophancy, a humiliating form of flattering or pandering to those in power for personal benefit. And the case of Shorty illustrates this vice. In Black Boy, Wright recounts an episode involving a fellow black teenager he knew in Memphis, a boy who went by the name Shorty. Shorty worked as an elevator operator and shared Wright's love of books. Neither young man was ashamed to be black, and each deeply resented racism, so Wright says. Yet, much to Wright's surprise, Shorty would regularly put on degrading performances for white passengers. One afternoon, needing money for lunch, Shorty decided to put on one of his performances. When a white man stepped into the elevator, Shorty turned to him with a forced grin and said in a self-mocking tone, "This black son of a bitch sure needs a quarter." He exaggerated his gestures, smiled broadly, and even began to drool, playing the clown for the white man's entertainment. Amused, the man asked what Shorty would be willing to do for the money. Without hesitation, Shorty said he'd let the man kick him. Then, in a theatrical gesture, he turned around, bent over, and jutted out his backside. The white man, taking sadistic pleasure in the spectacle, laughed, tossed a quarter to the floor, and when Shorty bent to pick it up, delivered a hard kick. Shorty clutched a coin, popped it into his mouth like a prize, and shouted, "This monkey's got the peanuts." Now, Wright says he saw scenes of this sort from Shorty many times, and he regarded each one as disgusting and loathsome. He once mildly reproached Shorty for his antics, declaring that the money wasn't worth it. Shorty's blunt response was to say, "Listen, nigga, my ass is tough and quarters is scarce." In a different audience, people would laugh, but I understand. You might not want to do that here. So in this response, Wright never broached the subject again. Though Shorty was poor and oppressed, it's pretty easy to see what's morally troubling about his behavior, right? He acts in a way that suggests that he places very little, if any, value on himself, and he's inviting other people to disrespect him and insult him. He willingly subordinates himself to degrading treatment for really minor advantages and has no shame in doing so. He openly flatters the unearned sense of superiority of those who dominate him. And it's worth noting that 25 cents in 1935 in today's US dollars is $5.84, right? Roughly 5 euros. Not a lot of purchasing power there, right? Barely enough to buy a decent sandwich. So in a word, Shorty demonstrates a sort of tragic loss of self-respect. But there's a second kind of compromise of self-respect that I think is actually much more common and much more difficult to assess. At least I find it challenging to think about. And it involves dissembling. The oppressed sycophant is an easier case to explain. It readily meets with our disapproval. Dissembling is more challenging, I think, because there are actually justified forms of dissembling. And so I'm interested here to try to identify those forms of dissembling that are unjustified and inexcusable and therefore undignified. In the early 1950s, Richard Wright often delivered a lecture titled "The Psychological Reactions of the Oppressed." This was later published in his 1957 collection, White Man Listen, a work that explores themes of racism, Black literature, and anti-colonial resistance across Africa and Asia. One of the central ideas in this lecture is what Wright refers to as acting. And this is a term he uses to describe a common psychological strategy among the oppressed, what I'm here calling the practice of dissembling. By acting, Wright means the tendency, at times even unconscious, to conceal or perhaps to misrepresent one's true beliefs, emotions, and attitudes from the powerful, out of a fear of reprisal. So it's the adoption of a false persona, a sort of protective mask that's worn to deflect scrutiny and avoid punishment. Through such dissembling, individuals attempt to navigate a hostile social environment by hiding their inner lives, preserving their safety at the cost of acting authentically. I'm sorry, at the cost of acting inauthentically. Specifically, the oppressed use dissembling to avoid any signs of aggression or anger. They seek to conceal any ambition to rise above their low station. What they're trying to do is communicate contentment with their social position. So in effect, it's a form of appeasement. Now, whether such dissembling is unethical or undignified, I think is going to depend at a minimum on what one is hiding and what one stands to gain by the pretense. Much also is going to depend on the motive for this acting. Some motives, I think, are disreputable, even when real danger is involved. Fear alone does not make one blameless. So to explore this matter further, I'd like to turn to Wright's last novel that was published in his lifetime, The Long Dream. And this appeared in 1958, just 2 years before his untimely death. I find it interesting in many ways, but one of the reasons I find it interesting is because it revisits themes found in a lot of his earlier work: fear, hopelessness, shame, self-hatred, self-abasement, and so on. The novel, I think, is more than a story about survival under oppression. I think it addresses the ethical dilemmas the oppressed face as they try to survive with their dignity intact. It's also about what happens to the souls of the downtrodden when their dreams of freedom die. The novel is structured around two Black male characters, a father and a son, living in the fictional city of Clintonville, Mississippi during the Jim Crow era. Tyree Tucker, the father, owns his own successful undertaker business, as well as other lucrative investments, including several properties that he rents out to other Black people. Part of his success is owed to his corrupt dealings with the white establishment, including the city's mayor and police chief, who conceal Tyree's illegal investments in the underground economy of sex work and gambling. Despite Tyree's wealth, he must abide by the racial prohibitions of the segregation regime and has to perform civility whenever faced with white power. Indeed, his illegal business ventures are permitted and protected only insofar as he acts with a kind of humiliating deference and subservience toward his white partners. Rex Fishbelly Tucker is Tyree's adolescent son. Fish, as he is generally called, has a naturally rebellious spirit and resents the ethos of fear that Jim Crow has instilled in many Black people. In accordance with this ethos, Tyree counsels his son Fish to adjust his ambitions to the realities of white supremacy. But Fish doesn't welcome these lessons. In fact, he's sharply critical of how his father has chosen to navigate Jim Crow society, often feeling shame and contempt, even hatred, he expresses, toward Tyree for not putting up more of a fight. The young Fish condemns his father for willingly subjecting himself to degrading humiliation in exchange for money, and perhaps more troubling, for taking a kind of pathetic pride in doing so. Tyree boasts about how his acting enables him to fool whites and to secure small favors that other black people are denied. But Fish refuses to accept that crying or grinning are the only options available to black people. He sees in his father a man consumed by fear, too quick to accommodate himself to his assigned place in the racial hierarchy and unwilling to offer any kind of resistance to it. To Fish, Tyree's life appears stripped of all dignity and is utterly devoid of hope. Though Fish has a natural disposition to resist, to fight back, his growing fear of white violence erodes this fighting spirit over time. He is particularly traumatized by the lynching of a young acquaintance, one Chris Sims, whom Fish admired. Chris was tortured, maimed, and killed by a white mob because of his sexual relationship with a white woman. Tyree wants this horrific episode to serve as a kind of lesson to Fish. He wants Fish to fear white people and at all costs to avoid even the appearance of any kind of intimate relationship with white women. Now, as Fish gets older, he partially comes around to Tyree's approach to living under oppression. So he says, life was a fight to keep from being killed, to keep out of jail, to avoid situations that induce too much shame. Nevertheless, Fish finds a sort of mix of shame and glory, kind of humiliation and pride, resignation and hope in Tyree's approach to living. But unlike Tyree, Fish refuses to fully adjust his life ambitions to the constraints of an oppressive social order. He simply can't accept the basic terms of a racially hierarchical society, nor can he be content with a life that's reduced to simple pleasures, money, sex, nice clothes, and so on. You can't live a life of that sort within the confines of a racial hierarchical society. So to him, it's undignified to mold one's personality to fit the expectations of group-based subordination. One shouldn't shape one's personal identity according to the norms of a deeply unjust regime. To do so is to reconcile oneself to oppression, to make peace with injustice. And Fish resists the temptation to rationalize or normalize a life shaped by degradation. Fish can't respect himself for continuing in Tyree's ways. He feels a kind of shame for not being able to live as a fully honest person without guile, duplicity, or pretense. He's ashamed of his obsequious performances before white people. Ultimately, finding life under Jim Crow too much to bear, he decides to join two childhood friends, then living in Paris. So like Wright, Fish chooses to live in exile rather than continue to live with so much fear and shame. Now, I think there are actually several lessons for the ethics of the oppressed that can be drawn from the long dream. I'm going to mention a few. One concerns the political morality of dissembling. Dissembling can be justified, for instance, when employed as a means of self-defense, particularly in the face of violent aggression or, say, a threat of severe poverty. Sometimes we can dissemble to protect vulnerable others, for example, children, from serious harm. Defiant acts of self-respect can sometimes put in jeopardy the safety of people we care about. And this can be a reason to swallow one's pride. Dissembling might also be warranted when it offers the only available path to carving out the possibility of a meaningful life. There are other times when strategic concealment of one's true feelings is not only prudent but ethically sound, such as when it's necessary to, say, bide one's time to prepare for a more effective form of resistance. Likewise, quietly accumulating resources to enable one's escape from bondage may require temporary acts of degrading deception. Subterfuge and duplicity, though generally wrong, can in such contexts be entirely defensible. Yet even in such moments, a person with a well-formed sense of self-respect will feel the sacrifice acutely as the loss of something irreplaceable and intrinsically valuable. When one no longer cares about being wronged and habitually exchanges dignity for material gain, self-respect has been fully relinquished. So here, I think Wright's insight into, this is what I think Wright's insight into the political ethics of the oppressed comes to. Dissembling is undignified when it's shameless conduct that intentionally conforms to the degrading image the dominant group has of the subordinate group, an image that lends legitimacy to the unjust hierarchical relationship. Habitual dissembling is contrary to a life well lived when it is devoid of moral purpose and rooted in resignation. So fear and hopelessness are the biggest internal obstacles to living with dignity within a system of enduring injustice. These attitudes remove the incentive to fight for better conditions, and they tend to corrupt one's character. Fear and hopelessness are internal threats that must be defeated or at least held at bay. So the oppressed often face difficult ethical dilemmas. The right choice isn't always obvious, morally unambiguous, or without its tragic consequences. Nevertheless, mere calculations of personal advantage or simple desire to avoid any sacrifice or personal harm shouldn't be decisive in these challenging ethical deliberations. Servility should be avoided even at some cost to oneself. Servility and a willing accommodation to oppression are at their core sort of personal vices, failings of character that diminish the lives of those who exhibit them. Such traits don't inspire admiration. These are not the hallmarks of a well-lived life under oppression. And in some cases, we may even feel a degree of contempt for those who so readily surrender their self-respect. Yet I think this raises a difficult moral question. Can such persons be rightly condemned? And if so, by whom? Now, many people would just say no, they shouldn't be condemned. After all, servile attitudes and the behaviors they produce do not typically wrong other people. Self-respect is something we owe ourselves, not an obligation that we owe to others. Though we cannot approve of servility, moral blame and resentment would seem to be misplaced. And given that we are speaking of people who are oppressed, to censure them might feel uncomfortably close to blaming the victim. However, I would argue that under conditions of oppression, surrendering one's self-respect can have profound consequences, not just for oneself, but for others as well. In such contexts, the way one conducts oneself can affect the fortunes of one's entire group. Members of oppressed communities then may have a duty, not only to themselves, but in fact to one another, to maintain their self-respect. So consider the traditional political culture of African Americans. When a black person accuses another of being an Uncle Tom, that charge typically carries at least one of two meanings. Most often, it's an allegation of betrayal, a claim that the accused has violated the community's norms of solidarity. That is, the individual is believed to have, say, abandoned or compromised the group's core values, that they've failed to show appropriate group loyalty, they've proven themselves in one way or another to be an untrustworthy ally, or have shown a troubling lack of concern for the well-being of Black people. But the charge, Uncle Tom, also carries a second meaning, one that, while rooted in concern for others, does not necessarily imply a kind of betrayal. Rather, the accusation here targets a particular kind of servility, the image of someone who willingly submits to humiliation and mistreatment in a way that reveals a profound loss of self-respect. Now, this too can be a serious character flaw, yet it's a kind of flaw that has rather wider implications, for it gives others, especially those who share the same vulnerable injustice, a strong reason to criticize, perhaps even to resent it. When a person suffers injustice not as an individual, but as a member of a targeted group, the person's response to that mistreatment becomes morally significant for the group as a whole. In such cases, affirming one's self-respect is not merely a matter of personal dignity, it is a public defense of the group's equal moral status, and thereby an expression of solidarity. Under Jim Crow, for example, Black people were entitled to voice strong disapproval of those whose servility signaled acceptance of racial subordination. By tolerating or minimizing injustice, what the Uncle Tom does is sends a rather damaging message that Black people are content with their inferior status. In doing so, they undermine the vital aspirations and basic interests of others in the community who continue to resist. Moreover, a person who lacks a strong sense of self-respect cannot be fully trusted as a reliable ally. In moments of crisis, their comrades would have good reason to worry that they might abandon the cause or even betray it out of fear or narrow self-interest. Remember that mutual trust is a core element of solidarity. A genuine commitment to preserving one's self-respect, even in the face of personal risk or loss, must therefore be seen as a necessary condition for a full standing within the solidaristic community. One must be prepared to endure sacrifice to preserve one's dignity, not only to live up to one's own moral worth, but also to reassure others in the collective struggle that one will not falter when adversity inevitably strikes. However, when a robust political ethic takes root within an oppressed community, individuals are not left to face their fear and despair and isolation. The group solidarity offers each member the reassurance that they're not alone, that others stand with them, ready to offer support as needed. The moral practice of protest, even when it's aimed at maintaining self-respect, need not be solitary. It can be a collective practice, sustained through loyalty and common purpose. And this commitment, when reciprocal, can inspire a sense of courage. And when such joint efforts lead to tangible victories, however modest, they help to sustain a sense of hope and stave off resignation. In this way, the commitment to preserving one's self-respect, though indeed a personal virtue, can be greatly reinforced by the moral strength of the group. The struggle to resist servility, then, need not rest solely on individual resolve. It can be carried forward together in solidarity. In his powerful portrayals of Black life under Jim Crow and urban ghettoization, Richard Wright did not merely expose the brutality of white supremacy, as is often said, and he's sometimes praised for that. I think he also laid bare the moral struggles of the oppressed, the temptations to surrender, the evaporation of hope, the fear and internal strife, the ethos of silence and submission. In addition, he urged a path forward. His aim here was to encourage Black people and others who experience enduring oppression, not only to reject servility, but to cultivate a proud, defiant, collective stance in the face of systemic injustice. He recognized that this moral transformation could not rest on individual will alone. Yes, it would require models of moral courage. Got to have bold, inspiring individuals with personal fortitude to resist. But just as critically, it will require solidarity. And so, following Wright, I want to affirm that solidarity and self-respect are critical elements of a life well lived under oppression. Properly understood, they are an answer, at least in part, to the question we started with. What constitutes a morally responsible and dignified response from the oppressed when confronted with enduring injustice? Self-respect makes solidarity feasible and effective. Solidarity, in turn, sustains and deepens self-respect. Together, they make it possible to live with dignity and a sense of meaning, even in the shadow of injustice. And if the oppressed can cultivate and maintain an unwavering commitment to these ideals, then together they may not only survive, but perhaps ultimately win. Thank you so much.
Great. I think we have to end here. Hold your applause for 1 second, because we have some final words to say as well. But that was a great place to end.
Yeah, I mean, thank you again for this wonderful lecture, for being here with us, for actually being such a great speaker, too. I mean, there are people who have great ideas, but are not like the same as you are. So I think everyone has enjoyed those lectures a lot. Thank you all for coming tonight. But before you leave, we want to again express our gratitude to all of those who have made this possible behind the scenes. So first of all, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the funding, also for the publicity, the hardworking and fantastic translators, Felix Kurz and Max Henninger.
Also, of course, the technical crew and everyone else here at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the director, Bonaventure, and everyone else. Was really wonderful to be in this beautiful building and lecture hall. The people from Busch und Dan who managed the admission, in particular Isabella Schelder, the HU video team, Jörg Schulze, Aline Reinsbach, and Gian-Piero Tari. The videos of the lectures will be, so the product of their work will be available soon on our YouTube channel. Also the media partners we worked with, Philosophie Magazin, Agora 42, Surkamp, of course, the publisher, which is publishing the Benjamin lectures, Daniela Burger, who created the visual appearance of the lectures.
As every year.
Yeah, and you've seen it behind Tommie and in front of Tommie and all around the city.
Yeah, and then of course the team of the Center for Social Critique, Swana, Friedemann, Hannes, Ruben, Samuel, Marvin, Sveta, and Christian. You have seen all of them, and be assured that was a lot of work, and they have been restless in order to make all this possible. Yeah. So these have been 3 really, really great and wonderful nights. Thank you all, and we hope to see all of you again next year when Deepesh Chakrabarti will present his Walter Benjamin lectures. Thanks again, Tommie.